4,000 years. That's how long separates a decision made in a tent in the desert from the conflict that dominates today's world headlines. When missiles cross the sky between Israel and Iran, few realize they are witnessing the most recent chapter of a rivalry that began with a single man, Abraham, and with two women who could never share the same roof. To understand how we got here, you need to go back to the beginning, not the political beginning, not the territorial beginning, but the family beginning. Because this conflict wasn't born in diplomatic offices or on battlefields, it was born within a family. And that's exactly why no negotiation has been able to resolve it in 4 millennia. The story begins in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous city located in what is now southern Iraq. There lived a man named Abram. The name had not yet been changed to Abraham. He had a wife named Sarai, a stable social position, and absolutely no rational reason to abandon everything. But then came the voice. The text of Genesis chapter 12 records the divine calling in a direct, almost abrupt way. God commanded Abram to leave his land, his kindred and his father's house, to go to a land that would be shown to him. There was no map, there were no coordinates, only a promise, and what a promise. God said he would make Abram a great nation, that he would bless those who blessed him and curse those who cursed him, and that in him all the families of the earth would be blessed. It was a complete package, numerous descendants, divine protection, and universal historical relevance. There was only one devastating problem with this promise. Sarai was barren. The biblical text emphasizes this detail even before narrating the journey. Genesis 11 verse 30 records it clinically. Sarai was barren. She had no children. The promise of a great nation had been made to a man whose wife could not bear children. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired, and headed toward Canaan. He crossed the land to the Oak of Moreh near Shechem, and there God appeared again, refining the promise. To his descendants he would give that land. Abram built an altar. It was the first of many. Each altar marked an encounter with the God who promised the impossible to a man who was aging without heirs. The years passed. 5 years, 10 years. Abram and Sarai remained childless. The promise remained suspended in the air, seemingly unreachable. And then came the night that would change everything. Genesis 15 describes an extraordinary scene. God took Abram outside the tent and asked him to look at the sky and count the stars if he was able. So would his descendants be. The text says that Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He believed. But Sarai was still barren. Put into perspective what it means to live under this tension. You have a divine promise of countless descendants. You believe in this promise to the point of abandoning everything and following into the unknown. And every day that passes, every month that your wife's menstruation confirms there is no pregnancy, the distance between the promise and reality seems to increase. Abram was 85 years old. Sarai was 75. Biology screamed that time had run out. It was in this context of silent desperation that Sarai made a decision that reverberates to this day. Genesis 16 begins with her presenting a proposal to her husband. She acknowledged that the Lord had prevented her from having children. She didn't question God, didn't complain about the promise, but she offered a practical solution, culturally acceptable at the time. She had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. Sarai suggested that Abram take Hagar as a concubine, so that through her Sarai might have children. It was a common practice in the ancient Near East. The Code of Hammurabi, written some centuries earlier, already regulated this type of arrangement. A barren wife could offer her servant to her husband, and the children born would be legally considered children of the wife. The text says only that Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. There is no record of hesitation, divine consultation, or questioning. After 10 years living in Canaan, waiting for the fulfillment of the promise, Abram accepted the human solution to a problem that God had promised to solve in a divine way. Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. A short sentence to describe the moment that would divide history. Hagar conceived quickly, and here began the first conflict. The text is brutally honest about the dynamic that set in. When Hagar realized she was pregnant, she began to look at her mistress with contempt. The servant who carried in her womb the patriarch's heir could not hide what she felt for the woman who remained barren. And Sarai, who had orchestrated the entire arrangement, could not bear the gaze of her own servant. Sarai confronted Abram. The wrong she suffered was his fault, she said. She had placed her servant in his arms, and now she was despised by that same servant. May the Lord judge between them. It was a heavy accusation, laden with resentment and regret. Abram responded by returning the responsibility. Hagar was Sarai's servant. She was in her hands. Let her do as she saw fit. What Sarai did was afflict Hagar. The Hebrew text uses a strong word, the same one used to describe the oppression of the Egyptians against the Israelites generations later. Sarai treated her pregnant servant with such harshness that Hagar fled. An Egyptian woman, alone, pregnant, crossing the desert toward her homeland. It was practically a death sentence, but Hagar was not alone. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the desert on the way to Shur, and there something extraordinary happened. Hagar became the first person in the Bible to receive a visit from the angel of the Lord, the first to whom God sent a heavenly messenger personally, and she was a runaway Egyptian servant. The angel asked where she came from and where she was going. Hagar responded with devastating honesty. She was fleeing from the presence of her mistress. The angel then gave a difficult order. She should return and submit to Sarai's authority. But along with the order came a promise. The angel said he would greatly multiply Hagar's descendants to the point that they could not be counted. The son she carried should be named Ishmael, because the Lord had heard her affliction. Observe the dimension of this promise. It was almost identical to the promise made to Abram. Countless descendants, great multiplication. God was promising to the Egyptian servant something very similar to what he had promised to the Hebrew patriarch. Two numerous peoples would be born from the same origin. But the angel added a prophetic description about Ishmael that echoes through the millennia. He would be a wild man, a wild donkey among men. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand would be against him. And he would dwell in the presence of all his brothers. It was a prophecy of perpetual conflict. The boy who had not yet been born already had his destiny traced as someone who would live in constant tension with those around him. Hagar returned. She submitted to Sarai, and she gave birth to a son whom Abram named Ishmael. The patriarch was 86 years old. He finally had an heir. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abram's only son. He grew up in his father's tent, learned the ways of the patriarch, assumed the role of firstborn. For all practical purposes, he was the one who would inherit the promises. Then God appeared again. Abram was 99 years old when the Lord manifested himself and established a formal covenant. The name Abram was changed to Abraham, father of many nations. Sarai became Sarah, princess, and came the news that would transform everything. Sarah, at 90 years old, would give birth to a son. His name would be Isaac, and with him God would establish an everlasting covenant. Abraham's reaction was revealing. He fell on his face and laughed. It was laughter of disbelief, of astonishment, perhaps of confused joy. And then he made a request that shows how much Ishmael meant to him. Abraham said to God that it would be enough if Ishmael might live before him. It was a father pleading for the son he already loved, for the heir he had raised for 13 years. God heard the request. He responded that he had blessed Ishmael and would make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. Ishmael would father 12 princes and would become a great nation. But the covenant, the specific and eternal covenant, would be established with Isaac, the son that Sarah would bear at that same time the following year. It was a crucial distinction. Both sons would be blessed. Both would become great nations. Both would have numerous descendants. But only one would carry the covenant. Only one would be the heir of the specific promise made decades earlier in Ur of the Chaldeans. The blessing was shared. The covenant was exclusive. Sarah conceived and gave birth to Isaac when Abraham was 100 years old. The impossible boy had arrived, the son of promise. Born of a 90-year-old woman and a centenarian man, was there breathing, crying, nursing. Sarah said that God had given her laughter. Everyone who heard would laugh with her. The laughter of disbelief had transformed into laughter of celebration. Isaac grew and was weaned. Abraham prepared a great feast to celebrate, and it was during this feast that the latent conflict exploded. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian laughing. The Hebrew text uses a word that can simply mean to laugh, to play, or can carry more negative connotations like mocking or scoffing. The ambiguity is intentional. What exactly Ishmael was doing is not clear. What is absolutely clear is Sarah's reaction. She demanded that Abraham cast out the servant and her son. The son of that slave woman should not inherit along with Isaac. It was a radical demand, cruel when viewed from outside. Ishmael was about 17 years old. He had grown up as Abraham's son, the only son for more than a decade, and now he should be expelled, sent away with his mother into the desert. The text says that this seemed very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. It was a father being forced to choose between his two sons, but God intervened. He told Abraham to listen to Sarah in everything she said, because in Isaac his descendants would be called. As for the son of the servant, God would also make him a nation because he was Abraham's offspring. The next morning, Abraham rose early. He took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulders. He gave her the boy and sent her away. Try to measure the weight of this scene, a father waking before dawn to send away his own son, preparing minimal provisions, placing a water skin and a little bread on the shoulders of a woman who would walk into the desert with a teenager, and then saying goodbye. The text does not record words of farewell, embraces, or tears. Only that Abraham sent them away, and Hagar departed, wandering in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water ran out. Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush and moved away the distance of a bowshot. She said she did not want to see the death of the boy. She sat across from him and wept aloud. It was rock bottom, a mother waiting for her son to die of thirst in the desert, without strength or hope to do anything but cry. But God heard the voice of the boy. The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and asked what troubled her. He commanded her not to fear, because God had heard the voice of the boy from where he was. She should arise, lift up the boy, and hold him by the hand, because God would make him a great nation. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well. She filled the skin and gave the boy water to drink. Ishmael survived. He grew up in the wilderness of Paran. He became an archer. His mother got him a wife from Egypt, and from the desert, far from his father's tent, far from the brother who had taken his place, Ishmael built his own story. Genesis 25 lists his 12 sons, 12 princes according to their tribes, exactly as God had promised, Ishmaelites, a nation born from an expulsion. The descendants of Ishmael spread from Havilah to Shur, which is near Egypt in the direction of Assyria. They were desert peoples, nomads, traders, warriors. Over time, they mixed with other Arab tribes and became part of the great mosaic of peoples who inhabited Arabia. The Islamic tradition, which emerged more than 2,000 years later, identifies Ishmael as the ancestor of Muhammad and the Arabs in general. It is a connection that millions of people maintain to this day. The descendants of Isaac followed another path. Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob, after a night of wrestling with a celestial being, received the name Israel. His 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Slavery in Egypt, Exodus, conquest of Canaan, monarchy, division, exile, return. The history of Isaac's children is the history of Israel, the people, and eventually the nation. But where does Iran enter this story? The connection is not as direct as that of Ishmael with the Arabs. The Persians, ancestors of modern Iranians, do not descend from Ishmael according to biblical or historical records. The Persians were an Indo-European people, ethnically distinct from the Semites, who descended from Abraham. So how did a conflict that began between Abraham's sons become a conflict between Israel and Iran? The answer lies in layers of overlapping history. The Persians entered the biblical narrative dramatically when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. It was Cyrus who allowed the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The book of Ezra records Cyrus's decree in detail. Isaiah chapter 45 even calls Cyrus the Lord's anointed, an extraordinary honor for a pagan king. At this moment in history, Persians and Jews were allies. The tension emerged gradually. The book of Esther, set in the Persian court during the reign of Xerxes, narrates an attempted genocide against the Jews orchestrated by Haman, an official of the king. The story ends with the salvation of the Jews and the punishment of their enemies, but reveals that even in periods of apparent peace, undercurrents of hostility existed. What transformed Persia into Iran and ally of the Arab peoples against Israel was the Islamic conquest. In the 7th century CE, Muslim Arabs conquered the Sassanid Persian Empire. Persia, which had been Zoroastrian for more than 1,000 years, gradually became Muslim, and with conversion came the adoption of narratives that identified the Arabs, and by extension Ishmael, as privileged peoples in sacred history. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 completed the transformation. Iran became a theocratic republic that officially adopted the Palestinian cause and opposition to Israel as pillars of its foreign policy. It was no longer just an ethnic or historical matter. It was ideological and religious. Modern Iran, even though not Arab, even though not biologically descended from Ishmael, had positioned itself as the leader of the Islamic world in its opposition to the Jewish state. Consider the irony of this configuration. A people who do not descend from Abraham became the main antagonist of another people who do descend. But by adopting the Islamic narrative, Iran also inherited the original tension: Ishmael versus Isaac, the son of the servant versus the son of the promise, the 4,000-year-old wound. There are those who argue that this interpretation oversimplifies modern geopolitics, and there is truth in that. The conflict between Israel and Iran involves oil, regional influence, nuclear programs, proxy disputes through groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. One cannot reduce everything to a family quarrel from 4 millennia ago, but one also cannot ignore the substrate. When Iranian leaders speak of wiping Israel off the map, when Israeli leaders describe Iran as an existential threat, there is something deeper at work than mere strategic calculation. There is a collective memory, a narrative of belonging and exclusion that transcends immediate politics. The stories peoples tell about themselves matter, and the stories of Israelis and Iranians, through different paths, lead back to the same tent in the desert. The biblical text records one final encounter between Abraham's 2 sons. It was at their father's funeral. Genesis 25, verse 9, says that Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, opposite Mamre. There, Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. The two brothers, separated for decades, reunited before the body of the father they had both loved and by whom they had both been loved. There is no record of words exchanged, reconciliation, or renewal of bonds, just two men fulfilling the duty of burying their father. And then, silence. Ishmael died at 137 years. His descendants settled from Havilah to Shur. Isaac's descendants continued in Canaan. Two peoples, two histories, one common ancestor. Archaeologists still debate the exact historicity of these narratives. Where exactly was Ur of the Chaldeans? What was Abraham's route to Canaan? Are the age numbers literal or symbolic? These academic questions have their value. But for the millions who live the conflict today, the question is not archaeological. It is existential. When a young Israeli serves in the defense forces on the northern border, watching for threats from Iran-backed Hezbollah, he carries with him a story. When a young Iranian hears speeches about the illegitimacy of the Zionist state, he also carries a story. They are different stories, told from opposite perspectives, but they converge at the same point of origin. A tent in the desert, an old man, two women, two sons, and a fracture that never healed. The tragedy of this story is not in the wickedness of its characters. Sarah was not evil in offering Hagar. She was a desperate woman, trying to fulfill a promise that seemed impossible by normal means. Hagar was not a villain in feeling pride at carrying the patriarch's son. She was a servant who finally had something her mistress did not have. Abraham was not cruel in accepting the arrangement or in sending Ishmael away. He was a man divided between two sons, obeying what he understood to be divine direction. Everyone was trying to do the best with the circumstances they had, and yet the result was catastrophic. 4,000 years of conflict were born not from villainy, but from humanity, from impatience with God's promises. From human solutions to problems that called for divine waiting, from jealousy, fear, and wounded pride. The most common ingredients of human experience combined in a configuration that produced eternal consequences. And this is perhaps the most disturbing lesson of the entire narrative. Great historical catastrophes do not always arise from great evils. Sometimes they arise from small decisions, understandable at the moment, that trigger consequences impossible to reverse. A wife offering her servant, a husband accepting, a servant looking with contempt, a mistress reacting with harshness, an expulsion at dawn, a boy crying of thirst in the desert. Each step made sense to whoever took it. None seemed at the moment to be creating a civilizational fracture. But the sum of these steps produced exactly that. Abraham died at 175 years. The text says he breathed his last in a good old age, advanced in years, full of days. But it does not say whether he died in peace. How could he? He saw his two sons separate. He saw Hagar flee into the desert. He saw Ishmael sent away with a skin of water and a piece of bread. The story that began with a promise of blessing for all nations ended by creating one of the greatest fractures in human civilization. Not because God failed, but because humans tried to accelerate the divine plan with human solutions. Today, 4,000 years later, the world still deals with the consequences of a night when a man entered the tent of his wife's servant. What seemed to solve a problem created a conflict that no war has been able to end, and no peace has been able to heal.